Jim Warren's Creepy magazine. And the very first issue, as I say, comes out in the very end of '64. It comes out quarterly, so our second issue is a little bit closer to our... Wow, I talk about exciting news, though. I mean, I heard the whole pitch, and I mean, oof, I mean, it was sounding good at 40%. It was sounding good at 60%, but my God, to 1,000%. And he didn't actually stop. You just don't know how this looks to everybody else, okay? Here we have probably the most important story in this whole series. And we continue the story of Balder. And this is where Kirby makes a very particular change in the mythology of the Norse and Germanic gods. Thor would be Donner. And the thing that we really have to get to is the only reason Nazi ideology can exist in the world is because people don't know anything. And if people just take the time to read a flippin' book, for example, this wonderful book that was written in the late 80s and has just been re-released, and it is basically an overview of all the things that archaeologists learned about ancient civilization. So hello and good day and welcome to the program Such As It Is. So what we're going to do here is we're going to rifle through my very old comic book collection from the 1960s. So as we mentioned earlier, I am indeed an uncle, and so you can think of me as your somewhat crazy uncle, a little bit off his rocker, but gee, he's letting you look at his comic book collection, and not just a comic book collection. No, it's an entire collection of all sorts of things. So it's almost as if I'm giving you a magic ladder into the attic, and you get to sort through the comic book collection in a very chronological way, as it turns out, without actually having to interact personally with your crazy uncle. Win-win. And in fact, my early memories of television begin at right about 1965, which I find coincidentally is right at that kind of crucial point where Marvel Comics really turns it up to 11, and we see that later half of the Marvel age of comics in that first decade where Kirby and Ditko really hit high gear and really do some amazing stuff, starting with when Wally Wood joins the team. And so all of this is happening right at 65. So we do have a few things about 1964 that we have to look back on. But of course, two of the most important movie franchises of the 60s began in 64, and that is first James Bond movie, Dr. No, which was an absolute classic that completely changed the movie industry, and of course was the other half of the British invasion, where as the Beatles had just made their way to America in the early 1964, and that was the year of all the British pop stars making their way to America and suddenly having a much larger and much more excited audience. And at the very same time, the Sergio Leone spaghetti western of Fistful of Dollars that's released and begins the long career of a Mr. Clint Eastwood, and it was a really great series of movies. I did watch them on television later on, and it's a very compelling character indeed. And although I was not really a big fan of Clint Eastwood's later film work, when he became a director, his film The Unforgiven is actually brilliant, and it deals with a very important topic, of course, the mythologizing of the history of the West, which is very insightful and one of those things that everyone did have to watch in school, along with Little Big Man and a number of other such films. But most importantly, these two characters are the most hardcore action heroes we'd seen up to this point. The fight scene in the second Bond film, From Russia with Love, is super memorable as just being one of the most dynamic film fights that anyone had ever performed. It was very eye-catching and later influential on the Fantastic Four, as we'll talk about later. So it's very interesting that as these two films are changing the direction of the film industry completely, the idea of the hero is changing. Jack Kirby, at the same time, in his Tales of Asgard series, introduces his story of Balder, and his way that he treats the character of Balder is very different than the actual mythological story of Balder, and this becomes really the central story of what's going on between Balder and Carnilla, the Queen of the Nords. That's really the most interesting part of the whole developing tale. So we'll have a look through those. We actually did this a little while ago. As I say, this is our kind of second go. We put it all aside and had a bit of a break and waited to see what things were happening. And this summer, things have changed direction, and so we are celebrating by talking about a bunch of new ideas that some people just might not be aware of. But here we have the introduction of Balder, and this is a very important area wherein Mr. Kirby starts to diverge from the canonical myths themselves, and so we introduce Balder, who is the noble and poetic. At the very beginning, we see Balder has a bit of a minstrel character at the very beginning, but that doesn't last very long. So anyway, this is part of, because Balder was such a beloved character, Odin had made all the creatures of the earth, the elements, the earth itself, to all swear to protect Balder. And here his warriors are testing out that mythological ability, and sure enough, every time somebody tries to smite Balder, Mother Nature herself intervenes. So then, having survived all of these, Thor himself says, well, let's try out the mighty hammer and see if he can stand up to that. And Odin intervenes and says, no, you don't need to actually do that. But what you will also notice about this story is this is Vince Colletta. And Kirby has already started to expand the page here. He's already established this 4-panel page as part of the structure of these stories. So there's a kind of an inspired 4-panel, but they're all 4-panel stories, where you'll notice in his original work, he's working with a very cluttered page. He's doing, and Ditko is very much like this as well, where they are putting lots and lots of panels on the page, getting a lot of action going, a lot of scene changes going in every story. And that we can see that Kirby started to develop a different style here with in these backup stories, and that development accelerates right where Vince Coletta starts being his inker. Thor and/or Journey into Mystery number 107, the first Grey Gargoyle story, very battered copy as you can see, but I think everyone has an affection for the Grey Gargoyle as a chemist who discovers a potion that gives him a touch of stone, like the Midas touch of gold, and what he finds, however, the wonderful properties of this is he can turn himself to stone, but he's an animated form of stone, and everybody else he touches become inanimate statues of stone. But I believe there's a time limit. I think you get an hour, and then you turn back. So it's not like a death sentence. It's a comic book. Come on. But so anyway, and he can fly somehow. That's the cape. But I guess he's playing with gargoyle. So a gargoyle has wings, and gargoyle then would be able to fly. And so he's looking at it here as a sort of a mythological character. He comes back, he uses the character again just before the big turning point that we are building up to here in March of 1965. And here we have probably the most important story in this whole series. And we continue the story of Balder. And this is where Kirby makes a very particular change in the mythology of the Norse and Germanic gods. Thor would be Donner in the Germanic version that Kirby's parents would have been familiar with, I am assuming, but you know how that goes. Anyway, so here we see where this really shows off the importance of Vince Coletta on Kirby's work. What you see here in this splash page is the incredible texture, that really dense and complex line work that he's adding to the story, which just adds a real depth to the field and gives Kirby a whole different approach to negative space. And so anyway, but as this important story goes, so here we have the beloved minstrel Balder, where we're making a bit of a connection to Orpheus here, if you're aware of Greek mythology. And so here he's being beloved by magical creatures. And here we have the first appearance also of Karnilla, the Norn queen, who would also become a very important character in later stories. And here, where she tries to ward off Loki, not even her magic can hold him off, but she says, I bet you know the secret of Balder's invulnerability, and what there's got to be some kind of a weakness. And Karnilla admits to Loki, yes, there was one plant, the mistletoe, that would not swear to Odin that it would protect Balder. And so that then is Balder's kryptonite-like weakness. And so, armed with this knowledge, Loki runs off, gets himself a couple of good mistletoe twigs, gets himself a blowgun made by a crafty troll, and then takes a blowgun loaded with the deadly mistletoe dart, and he goes to, as they are practicing their sword play, and at a critical moment of when Balder trips and falls, Loki thinks now's the time he can make him die mysteriously, and is about to shoot the deadly dart. But just as he does this very thing, the blowgun blows up into flame, and Karnilla contacts him through her magic orb and says, okay, well, I did tell you this weakness, but I, on the other hand, also pledged to also protect Balder. So even though I told you his weakness, I can't let you exploit it. And so Balder then lives through this turmoil. Now, this sets up the forbidden romance between Karnilla and Balder, which is really ultimately the most interesting part of the whole story. But it's a critical situation insofar as he's diverged from the original story, which is also referenced in Alan Moore's Top 10 in a most hilarious way. And it is one of the funniest mythological sequences I have ever read. But the sort of the critical thing here is Balder's supposed to die. In the original myth, Loki tricks his blind brother Honir to hit Balder with the dart, which he does and indeed succeeds in killing Balder. And so Balder represents the dying god, which is a motif that we see very broadly through mythology and is a really important character. And we also see that this isn't just a random choice by Kirby. We see something I did not notice until rereading as I'm going through all this stuff again, that Balder is referenced in the very beginning of the mythology of the new gods. The very idea of the noble god Balder and the evil sorceress Karnilla, in this case, that is the basis of the new god mythology. And so we will have many opportunities to come back and discuss the dramatic importance. Oh, ouch. Oh, ah. But a gem nonetheless. And then we will also have to congratulate our American friends on the recent good news that you're going to have your drug prices lowered. Wow, I talk about exciting news though. I mean, I heard the whole pitch and I mean, oof, I mean, it was sounding good at 40%. It was sounding good at 60%, but my God, he had to go all the way to 1,000%. And he didn't actually stop. You just don't know how this looks to everybody else, okay? You just don't understand how everybody else, they don't have your crazy media. People are not hypnotized by the repetition of things that are not true to the extent they are in the United States. So as we're talking about mythology, well, we will be talking about mythologizing. And the thing that we really have to get to is the only reason Nazi ideology can exist in the world is because people don't know anything. And if people just would take the time to read a flippin' book, for example, this wonderful book that was written in the late 80s and has just been re-released. And it is basically an overview of all the things that archaeologists learned about ancient civilization, starting around just after 1945, when, well, people could actually go out in the field and not get killed again. But anyway, the important point is, everything that Nazis believe, this whole patriarchy thing, is a complete lie. It's been a lie perpetrated by the Catholic Church, who had complete control over everything for hundreds of years, and it's just being perpetuated. It's all wrong. None of it is true. So this could be considered one of the background textbooks to our incredibly entertaining discussion of mythology that will evolve out of Jack Kirby's incredible work on Thor, which was absolutely, unquestionably the most exciting and interesting comic book of the 1960s. And so we will have a look at all that, and we'll put it all into some kind of context, even though we're not really talking about my memories about television just yet, but we will get to that as we get through these preliminaries. Okay, let's have a look at early Ditko work and the lead up of the development of the Doctor Strange character and the larger cultural zeitgeist that he was working with and was, as we'll see, much more aware of than the average cartoonist, which is a very interesting thing in itself. So we will dive into that with our brand new feature. Ditko's Doctor Strange series began without cover notation in Strange Tales number 110, and he's introduced as the Master of Black Magic. Now, the name had been used once before by a Kirby character, but in the service of a continuing character, they just recycled it, and a couple issues later we get his origin, which is pretty iconic. A drunken, washed up surgeon stumbles into a Tibetan monastery, and so on. So in that first year and a half of developing this series, Ditko just came up with some of just the most incredible designs and images in his splash pages, particularly, but over just a few issues, over a couple of battles that go on with Baron Mordo, he just evolves this incredible language of images to depict the magical world, and he starts out being very kind of dark and light, but very quickly evolves, and you really do see his knowledge of the developments going on in the modern art scene and just in the decades previously, and it really shows up in just a very surreal nature of his dream world, and then just the very abstract forms of his interdimensional traveling. And there's, of course, also the very hallucinogenic imagery that he touches on, and this is where he gets himself into trouble, and this is where Ditko inadvertently connects into a zeitgeist that is evolving of the underground classic that was Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, which is about his experiences taking mescaline. Now, Huxley himself, who's maybe more famous for writing the science fiction story The Shape of Things to Come, was also very interested in Eastern meditation and mysticism. A little Canadian note I wasn't aware of is that it was in fact a Canadian doctor that he conducted his experiments with mescaline with, a Mr. Humphrey Osmond, which I didn't know. But so far as the creator Ditko himself, when he was thinking black magic, he was thinking the history of comic books, and he was thinking particularly about one of the most famous magical characters of all, written by Superman's own Jerry Siegel, who first appeared in More Fun Comics number 52 in 1940, and that's the Spectre, and he was the first magical superhero character in a comic book full of adventures and mounties and safaris and whatnot. A couple issues later, he's joined by another superhero, magical origins Dr. Fate, who is introduced by a battle with a very colorful villain, which he dispatches in the first story, throws him out a window, but doesn't stop him from returning the very next issue, and with depicting a magical battle. It's one of the great 1940s superhero covers, and what classic flames bursting out of the fingertips depicting magic, and the other classic being the zigzag line, kind of what lightning emoji we would call it nowadays, that was used for so long in comics. When it came to other dimensional realms, it was more the Spectre who would sort of journey off into the afterlife and visit other planets and dimensions, and it was all very sort of cloudy and with the kind of odd planet and star and whatnot. He also spent a lot of time being invisible or immaterial, and so it was really that kind of juxtaposition of the magic and the immaterial astral form that kind of came together in Ditko's ideas of Doctor Strange. In my opinion, I'm just speculating, of course. Dr. Fate himself would kind of quickly turn into more of a crime fighter. He even changed his mask more like a Batman mask, and he became joined by a bunch of other kind of superheroes who were more science-based and crime-fighting oriented, and so the Spectre got bumped off the cover pretty quickly, and within a few issues he was like bumped right out of the comic altogether, and that was it for magical characters for a few years, until right after the war a brand new company, Spark Publications, came out with 3 new superhero characters by 3 classic famous cartoonists, Jerry Robinson, Mort Meskin, and of course Mac Raboy. And although I think the first 2 characters were original, the Green Llama actually had an older pedigree, which I did not know, although I had know of the comic. But through a great series of documentaries by the FizzPop 1 channel on YouTube, he filled in an incredible backstory that I was completely unaware of. And also, why is it the Green Llama? Well, because first it was the Green Hornet, and the importance of the Green Hornet into the entire genre of the costumed adventure is kind of crucial, and something that we aren't aware of, and it is well worth looking into that. But anyhow, beginning with this pulp adventure, it turns out the character is actually based on a very then a well-known kind of guy talked about in the newspapers, who was an actual guy who spent time in Tibet. So right in the kind of the heat of the pulp hero phase, where we're most familiar with the superhuman adventures of Doc Savage and the mysterious Shadow, the Green Llama himself had a series of pulp adventures and even a radio show, and somehow he used these powers of meditation and a red scarf to fight crime in some way that perhaps I will become interested enough to find out one day. But more importantly, the Green Llama comic, which was something that we were all aware of because of Mac Raboy, and now it's something that you could find online and actually read, which was really, was fun. But Raboy is most famous, of course, for his work on Captain Marvel Jr. In the Master Comics. So Raboy's version of the Green Llama is not so much meditative as a guy who says a magic word and now can fly and is invulnerable. And so through another series of these really great double-page splashes, he does, well, some of the great intros to stories we've ever seen, but it's one particular character though that did really stand out to me. And there's a story with the Crime King, I believe. And so another great double page splash. But through a couple of sequences, all of a sudden, there's elements of this character that suddenly will probably seem familiar. So he first encounters this character who has a bag of tricks, and he throws a bunch of marbles that makes the guy who can fly fall down, and let's not think about it too much. He gets hit with a pumpkin at one point, and then fighting the fellow, he realizes he's wearing a mask. You put those ideas of a mask, the pumpkin, the bag of tricks, all together. Wait, those funny shoes. Hold on a second. These are in fact the building blocks of the great Green Goblin character in Spider-Man. So you can see these elements all building up to the March of 1965. And as we will see, the real push of the change in complexity in what we think of as the Marvel style and what would develop into what we think of as the classic Marvel multi-issue story would be introduced by Steve Ditko. And it was really Steve Ditko's experimenting with storytelling and the idea of the serialized story that changes Jack Kirby's writing style and makes him develop into a much more exciting storyteller indeed. And of course, we are hoping you are all feeling well and up to snuff, as it were. And if you are not, let's concentrate on some things that will make you feel a little bit more positive about life itself. The problem we have with a media that is constantly working on a death spiral of paranoia and fear, that's going to put anybody in a dark space. And if you already are a bipolar kind of personality, it's definitely going to pull you into the darker side of things. And one of the ways to do that, get out of that mindset, is thinking about more positive things and thinking in a more creative way. And that's why LSD is really good for breaking people of the habit of alcoholism, but it was suppressed for that very reason. So we have to take our approach to mental health and make it as conceptual as we can and just integrate it into our lifestyle. And if you dwell on really negative things all the time, you're going to get into a negative mind space. That's just how the mechanics of these things work. So I'm going to introduce a special feature right here. In lieu of a mental health moment, we are going to have what we now call pearls of neurodivergent wisdom. And the thing about being an old manic depressive is I've been through some stuff and I'm still here. And so that means I must have figured out a thing or two. And if I can help you get through some stuff along the way, it's good for everybody. So today's little pearl of wisdom is simply this. Remember, you can't give your head a shake until you pull your head out of your butt. You can take that to the bank. And so whereas 1967 will be always remembered as the summer of love, I'm hoping that we're going to remember the summer of 2025 as the summer of a return to sanity. Fingers crossed. And at the very end of 1964, we saw an entry into the publishing business that would be a very important player in the years to come, and that was Warren Publishing. And the black and white magazine Eerie hits the stands, and it has just an amazing collection of artists that we all know from the EC comics of 10 years before. And so it is a visually really stunning book, and it reflects how the horror movies of the 30s and 40s were being played on television over and over again, and we were all seeing them again and again, and their popularity just basically kept growing. And so that led to 1964. I believe we have The Addams Family as the first, and then a couple of years later we do have The Munsters. And this is all part of this real revived interest in the horror movie genre, and that would evolve a little further in a couple more years, and then you would see movies like Night of the Living Dead and The Exorcist, which would really completely tie up the whole mass culture in a real horror-oriented genre for quite a while. And so we saw that as a real big shift in the 70s in comic books, in the direction of things being not so mythological and much more of a supernatural horror kind of direction, which I personally wasn't quite as fond of, and my bias will probably be reflected somewhere. But anyway, the early Warrens are really super interesting, worth having a look at, and this it begins in 64, so we will tie this in. And just a few months before, at the very end of 1964, a brand new black and white magazine came onto the scene, Jim Warren's Creepy magazine. And the very first issue, as I say, comes out in the very end of 64. It comes out quarterly, so our second issue is a little bit closer to our March of 65, but of course it's such an important addition to the comic book scene, one that by the 1970s would become by far much more influential. And what we see here is many of the artists made famous by EC Comics, who of course ran afoul of and here we have Al Williamson, an absolutely great Al Williamson story. And of course, EC ran into difficulties in the 1950s, being very adult-oriented, the paranoid era of the McCarthy era 50s. Popular book, The Seduction of the points out that there is a lot of very adult material going on in 1950s comics, and this of course leads to a big crash for EC Comics, which only survives as Mad Magazine beyond that point. And so Warren figures that by using a black and white magazine format, the paranoia about comic books corrupting children and the constraints of the comic code authority would not apply, and so they could do horror comics the way they always meant to. And here's a Reed Crandall story. He does some absolutely magnificent stuff in these things. Of course, this is all having to relate to just the overall interest in horror that has come about with all the classic 30s horror movies being replayed on television. We have Frazetta story. He only does a couple of the actual internal stories. He becomes their cover artist for a little while. And I mean, they're just some absolutely remarkable stories that are really, really something to see. Now, one of the things that is really most important, and here we have a Gray Morrow story. Gray Morrow is somebody who does a lot of work for a lot of various publishers. I don't think he actually really ever worked for Marvel and DC, but he worked for a variety of other publishers, did some newspapers work as well. guy who's always very interesting, but didn't really relate to the superhero genre per se. Another Williamson story. This one's sort of a parody on the kind of internal abuse that always seems to go on in the cartooning industry, where people are always being exploited in various ways. And here we had a rather funny retributive justice story. But so this has just begun. Angelo Torres, I believe, is the last story here. And you'll find that many of these stories are written by Archie Goodwin, and Archie Goodwin would later on become very important, work for both Marvel and DC. But let's see if we can move ourselves a little bit closer to a little bit saner view of our own personal worlds, at least.